Hello everyone, a very good morning and welcome to Unacademy, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. Welcome to the daily Hindu news analysis. So let's begin today's discussion by first looking at the topics that we are going to discuss. From the Delhi edition of the Hindu, I have chosen 8 important articles for a detailed discussion. We have 4 columns and editorials which are very relevant for the mains exam, and the rest of the articles are very important for the prelims examination. So let us cover these topics one by one, and if you guys are benefiting from these initiatives, do support us with your likes, share your comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So before we start, we have an announcement. To help you prepare for current affairs, we have launched a dedicated program which is UCAN, or Unacademy's Current Affairs Navigator. So under this program, we are conducting live classes from Tuesday to Friday, and this is a year-long program. So this will help you cover all the important newspapers and magazines that are required for the UPSC exams. If you wish to enroll for the program, do find the link in the video description below and do join the program so that you can simplify your current affairs preparation. So with this, let's begin with today's discussion by looking at the first column from page number 8. This article is related to environment and ecology and to the topic of climate change. The Hindu carries a detailed article today, and it talks about climate equity, and it also examines the role of IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it emphasizes why climate equity is very important, particularly for developing countries. So let us look at the context in which this article has been brought out by the Hindu, and then we will dive deep into the topic and carry out a thorough analysis of all the related issues as well. This article has been brought out by the Hindu because recently there was a study published by the National Institute of Advanced Studies from Bengaluru based on the findings of IPCC assessment reports. So this study, conducted by Indian researchers, it has carried out more than 500 different emission projections for the future, how emissions could affect the global economy in the coming decades, how it could impact economies around the world, how it could impact developing nations as compared to developed countries. So these modeling studies have been done, and more than 500 such emission scenarios have been studied by these group of Indian researchers. In all these modeling studies that they have carried out, which is all based on the findings of IPCC assessment reports, they have come to one conclusion, that is, developing countries, underdeveloped countries, they will continue to bear a higher burden as a result of climate change. As compared to developed nations, developing and underdeveloped countries will continue to bear a higher burden when it comes to climate mitigation efforts, when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and even with regard to adopting carbon sequestration and carbon capture technologies. There will be a greater burden on developing and underdeveloped nations of the global south as compared to the developed countries of the global north. Even though the developed nations are largely responsible for historical emissions, the higher burden, the higher impact on developing and underdeveloped countries is likely to continue for the coming decades. And that is the crucial finding of this study that was conducted by the National Institute of Advanced Studies. So based on this, let's go deep into the topic. Let's understand what is the assessment brought out by these researchers. Let's understand the divide with regard to developed and developing countries as far as climate action is concerned. We'll also talk about IPCC, the role of IPCC, and the importance of its assessment reports. So the conclusion of the study is that in all the 500 plus future scenarios that were studied based on these models, there is a clear disparity between developed and developing nations that is likely to persist at least till the middle of the century, at least till 2050. So based on these findings, first let's understand the concept of climate equity. Let's understand what is equity in the context of climate change. Let's understand what the developed countries have contributed to climate change, what is the impact on developing nations, and why it is important to maintain the principle of equity when it comes to the efforts of developed and developing countries. So let's have a conceptual and detailed discussion on this. Then I'll give you some important facts about IPCC and its assessment reports as well. Then finally, we will analyze the findings of this study. See, if you look at climate change, which is largely anthropological, which has been triggered by man-made activities, this is primarily a result of industrial activities accompanied with other unsustainable man-made activities, from agriculture to various industrial activities to deforestation, right? The large-scale burning of fossil fuels. They are the ones which have primarily contributed to large-scale greenhouse gas emissions, which directly results in global warming. So as the atmospheric temperature starts heating up, as the global average temperatures goes up, it has a direct impact on all the important ecological processes. It influences the biogeochemical cycles. It directly impacts our ecosystems, the marine environment. It triggers the melting of the ice caps, the glaciers, and contributes to rising sea levels. It will completely disturb the global climatic and weather patterns, and it could increase the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, leading to more disasters, such as more intense cyclones or more frequent droughts, floods, and even forest fires. So this scenario that we are staring at, rather the scenario in which we are already living in, is indeed very alarming, very dangerous for the global economy itself and for life on Earth itself. So when you look at the contribution of different countries with regard to emissions, developed countries have made the biggest contribution. Since the Industrial Revolution, almost since 2 centuries, it's the developed industrialized countries which have primarily contributed to greenhouse gas emissions. And this is what accounts for historical emissions. Now these countries, let's say for example European countries or United States or other industrialized economies, they have become developed today because they could freely burn fossil fuels. They had no restrictions on them. They could overexploit the resources, burn fossil fuels as they wanted, and that is what promoted their industrial growth, their agricultural activities, and that is how they became developed nations or industrialized economies in the first place. Since there was no restriction on them, no caps on emissions, no caps on exploitation of resources, they could freely burn fossil fuels as they wanted, and that is what primarily drove the growth of these developed industrialized economies. So as a result, they managed to solve their basic socio-economic problems. They lifted their people out of poverty, provided them better education, better healthcare, created better infrastructure. So they have solved their developmental problems primarily by relying on fossil fuels and such related resources, which has contributed to global warming and climate change. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is that there is a certain limit with regard to the emissions that we can release into the atmosphere. There is a certain carbon budget for the Earth, right, beyond which climate change will become irreversible. And majority of this carbon budget, majority of it, has already been consumed by the developed nations. The developed industrialized countries, they have taken up most of the carbon budget, leaving behind very, very little space in the carbon budget for developing and poor countries. So if you imagine this as a pie chart, right, if you imagine the carbon budget, the carbon space available for human development, right, as a pie chart, majority of the share of the carbon budget has already been taken away by developed industrialized nations. They have left behind a very small carbon space for developing and poor countries, which makes it all the more difficult for them to grow their economies and to solve their socio-economic problems. So now that we have more awareness about climate change, and since we already have a climate change convention which is in place, there are strict caps, restrictions on emissions, and around the world there is a push towards transitioning to cleaner and renewable forms of energy. there is an active push to the Climate Change Convention and the Paris Agreement that we have under it to adopt cleaner forms of fuels, to switch to renewable forms of energy, to cut down on deforestation and promote afforestation, and as well as to ensure that we are adopting a greener path by limiting emissions, not just carbon dioxide emissions, but even methane and other greenhouse gas emissions. So this transition that countries are trying to adopt, right, as a part of the mitigation adaptation measures, this comes at an economic cost. Countries will have to invest heavily in order to make this transition possible, to move away from the cheaper fossil fuels and to adopt the more expensive, clean and renewable forms of energy. It will require enormous investments and a complete transition in the economic model of a country itself. So this is where developing and poor countries will face a bigger challenge. They may not be able to afford these investments, and more importantly, they may not even possess the right technology to do that. Whereas developed countries, on the other hand, they not only have the money to carry out this transition, they own the technology as well, which enables them to make an easier transition. Right? So even though these developed countries are trying to make a transition, their per capita emissions, their consumption of fossil fuels will continue to remain very high in the coming days as well. Given their high consumption pattern, right? Especially if you look at, let's say, United States, the US has one of the highest per capita emissions even today. Even European countries, despite all the efforts that they are taking up, right? Their per capita emissions are still very, very high because of the high standard of living and the heavy consumption pattern that their economies have built into the lifestyle, into the day-to-day lives of their people. If you compare India's per capita emissions with that of the US, you will find an enormous difference. An average American contributes nearly 15 to 18 times more emissions than an average Indian. That is the kind of difference that we are talking about. So if you look at developing nations, poor countries, underdeveloped countries, their per capita emissions are still amongst the lowest. But these developed nations, right, they will continue to have very high per capita emissions, and no matter what they do, they will never account for their historical responsibilities. It is their responsibility to ensure that they contribute more to tackle historical emissions. It is their responsibility to ensure that they give a greater carbon space in the carbon budget for developing and poor countries so that they can continue to burn fossil fuels, which is a cheaper form of fuel, at least for a few more decades, so that they can meet their developmental goals. So this principle of ensuring that developed countries, which are responsible for historical emissions, right, they are held accountable for historical responsibilities, which means they have to contribute more. They have to put in more money, more effort, more technology to achieve climate action. They should assist developing countries and poor countries as well by providing them finance, by providing them with technology, so that even developing nations and poor countries can make a transition towards cleaner economies. So it is this additional burden which is supposed to be taken up by the developed countries, which we refer to as historical responsibilities. Since they are responsible for historical emissions, it is only fair to expect them to own up for historical responsibilities as well. Now, this principle is nothing but the principle of equity. This was enshrined into the climate change negotiations at the very early stages when the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in 1997. A principle called CBDR was incorporated into climate change negotiations. Under the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, countries like India, along with China, and the G77 group of countries, which represent the global south, which is a collective grouping of developing, poor and underdeveloped countries, they championed this principle called CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities. So what does it mean? It basically means that the goal of fighting climate change is a common goal for everyone, for every country, for every person on the planet. Because global warming and climate change will not spare anyone. It will affect every country, it will affect every person. So the goal to fight climate change is a common goal. But however, the responsibilities to be taken up has to be differentiated from country to country. Why? Because there are some countries which are more responsible for climate change, which have contributed more emissions, which we call as historical emissions. There are few developing and poor countries which require a greater carbon space to allow themselves to grow and meet their developmental challenges. These countries require assistance as well with regard to finance and technology. So ensuring that there is a greater burden on developed countries and ensuring that they help and assist the developing countries as well is nothing but your principle of equity. Because the commitment, the effort, the investment of developed and developing nations with regard to climate change should be based on their historical emissions, right? It should be in line with their historical responsibilities. So this is the whole principle of CBDR. The goal of fighting climate change is common to every country, but the responsibilities are differentiated. It is differentiated on the basis of their historical emissions. So CBDR principle was enshrined into Kyoto Protocol and it became an integral part of climate change negotiations. But however, over the decades, the principle of equity has been diluted. For example, if you look at the Paris Agreement itself, there is a dilution of CBDR principle. To a certain extent, the CBDR principle has been diluted because countries are just coming up with voluntary contributions, right? They come out with their intended nationally determined contributions, and there is no fixed cap or emission caps on developed countries and industrialized economies. Countries are coming out with their voluntary announcements regarding what they will do to bring down emissions and to assist in climate action efforts, and there are no binding obligations on these countries. But however, the principle of CBDR and equity still remains integral to climate change negotiations. Even though it has seen a dilution, it still remains very, very relevant, as it is always insisted upon by developing countries like India. India always ensures that climate change negotiations, that we insist upon the principle of equity and we try to instill the principle of CBDR. Now, if you look at IPCC, which is referred to in this article, it stands for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC, as the name itself tells you, is an intergovernmental body that acts as a think tank, a scientific think tank, to assess the climate change convention. It basically brings out the climate science. It helps us understand the science behind climate change. It monitors emission levels. It comes out with these assessment reports predicting future emission scenarios, how it is going to impact our ecosystems, how it is going to impact the physical systems on Earth, how it will impact economies around the world, how it will affect our land use and our consumption from the environment. So all these patterns, these future models are brought out by IPCC, and it establishes the science behind climate change. So this input brought out by IPCC through its assessment reports is very, very crucial as part of the climate change diplomacy's concern. So this organization was established in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Environment Programme. Please make a note of this fact. It could be very important for your prelims. So since 1988, IPCC has been working with researchers around the world and research organizations around the world who conduct all the research and studies. And by using this data, this scientific data, IPCC comes out with these assessment reports. Till date, IPCC has carried out 6 assessment cycles. It has brought out 6 assessment reports over the last 3 decades, from 1990 till 2023. The first assessment report, AR1, Assessment Report 1, was brought out in the year 1990, 2 years after IPCC was established. The latest report, the 6th assessment report, was published just last year in 2023. So now, IPCC is focusing on the 7th assessment cycle. It's in the process of bringing out assessment report number 7, which will take another 6 or 7 years. Maybe by 2028, 2029, we will have the 7th assessment report from IPCC. So what exactly are these assessment reports? What are the different types of reports brought out by IPCC under each assessment cycle, and how does this help in our efforts against climate change? That is what we should understand. See, these IPCC reports are brought out by 3 working groups of IPCC. There are 3 dedicated working groups established within the IPCC. There is one working group focusing on the physical science behind climate change. It mainly examines the physical processes involved in climate change and the changes that are being driven in our physical geographical systems. That is studied, examined by this working group, and it brings out a special report, a dedicated report on physical science. There is another working group working on climate adaptation. That is, how should we adapt to the reality of climate change? Because climate change is something which is already impacting us. Weather systems are undergoing changes. We are witnessing more frequent and more intense extreme weather events. So especially island countries, poor countries, developing nations, they will be the first to be hit and affected by these disasters, particularly by rising sea levels, by increasing coastal floods and coastal erosion, by increasing droughts, heat waves and forest fires and cyclones. So we have to start adapting to the reality of climate change, and we have to live with the fact that we will experience these extreme weather events. So you will have to make yourself more resilient. You have to make the societies, the infrastructure, the economies more resilient to withstand the impact of climate change. Right? We should not just focus on mitigation. Mitigation is about reducing emissions, bringing down emissions so that we can tackle global warming. Apart from mitigation efforts, we should focus on adaptation measures as well. Right? The communities have to be made resilient, like coastal communities, for example. They should be made resilient to withstand the impact of climate-related disasters. So with regard to adaptation measures and the future of climate adaptation, a specific report is brought out by this working group. And the third major report is on mitigation action. That is, on what paths to follow to reduce emissions. How can we switch away from fossil fuels and adopt new forms of fuels and energy which contributes less to global emissions? Right? It also talks about carbon capture technologies, carbon sequestration technologies, afforestation. So all these are mitigation measures which are dealt with by a separate report. So these 3 working groups of IPCC, they bring out 3 separate reports. One on physical science, one on adaptation, and another one on mitigation. Understood? So this collectively makes up the reports of the assessment cycle, of a particular assessment cycle. Apart from these primary reports, there is one synthesis report which is also introduced, which is basically a collation of the other 3 reports. It consolidates all the findings, the assessments of the 3 primary reports. They're all consolidated into one synthesis report, which is finally published by IPCC. Other than that, IPCC also brings out these thematic reports based on special themes. Like, for example, impact of climate change on health, impact of climate change on, let's say, food security. So such special thematic reports are also brought out which focus on specific issues. So these are the different reports which are part of every assessment cycle. Each assessment cycle will take around 6 to 7 years, and till date, IPCC has completed 6 assessment cycles. All right? So the article, it's referring to this study conducted by the National Institute of Advanced Studies, right? And this study itself is based on the recent report, the 6th assessment report that was published by IPCC last year. So as I told you, right now IPCC is in the process of carrying out the 7th assessment cycle. So in maybe another 5-6 years, we will see that IPCC will publish these reports as part of the 7th assessment cycle. Now, since we have covered the basics right now, this is the right moment to talk about the article itself. What are the writers talking about? What was the finding of this new study? Why is it a matter of concern? So let's take a look at this, which is the last part of the discussion under this article. The first question is, how does IPCC assess future scenarios? right? I told you that IPCC is bringing out these projection reports, which helps us understand the future of climate change, the impact of climate change on the future economy, the future societies. So how are these projections being done? On what basis does IPCC carry out these studies and brings out these assessments? Right? That is something you should understand. These assessments, these future scenarios and projections, they're all based on modeling systems. Just like weather modeling systems are used for weather forecasting to forecast any adverse weather conditions. On similar lines, there is a mathematical statistical model devised which is run through these supercomputers based on accurate scientific data, which gives us these climate models based on which the future scenarios are evaluated, right? Based on this evaluation, the assessments are brought out. So there are modeled pathways created by the IPCC working groups in collaboration with various research institutions around the world. So climate scientists, they constantly track and monitor various parameters, from glacier levels to the rate at which polar ice caps are melting, the rate at which average temperatures are increasing. All these vital parameters are tracked and the data is fed into these climate models, which are run on supercomputers to provide a modeled assessment. Officially, these models are called integrated assessment models. Of course, any projection, right, any prediction of future scenarios, it is often derived through a mathematical statistical model with the help of supercomputing abilities. So that is exactly what IPCC also does. So it uses these integrated assessment models to predict and evaluate future scenarios, like what would be the primary source of fuel in the coming decade or in the coming few decades. What will be the impact of human development on our forests, right? What will be the land use change that is going to take place? What is the extent of deforestation that we are looking at? What is the extent of afforestation that we can carry out, right? By what extent can we bring down fossil fuel based emissions, and how can we switch to cleaner forms of energy? How quickly can we adopt, let's say, solar, wind, nuclear and other forms of cleaner energy? So these future assessments are predicted and brought out through these assessment models. It gives you a very good idea, a fair picture about the economic impact of climate change. How will the GDPs of different countries be impacted? How will it affect the weaker sections, right? So these studies can be brought out based on these modeling projections. So that is the relevance of these IPCC reports. Of course, it will not be 100% accurate. Any modeling, any projection, right, will have some shortcomings, because at the end of the day, it is a statistical model through which the projections are being done. But at least it paints a picture of the future. It gives us early warning, right? It gives us few signs of the danger signals ahead and what actions, what measures need to be taken to ensure that we avoid or at least reduce the impact of these hazardous situations, right? So that is where these assessment models become very, very critical. They help us understand the vegetation changes that we are going to witness, the changes in the physical geographical systems of the earth, how it will affect human activities or human civilization in general, how will it affect global economies at a macroeconomic level, right? So these kind of assessments are brought out through these projection models. But as I told you, no prediction model is 100% accurate. Of course, there will be shortcomings, right? So here with IPCC reports, the biggest shortcoming is that the reports are mainly focused at a global level. Because, as I told you, climate change will not spare any country. It will not respect these territorial boundaries that we have drawn, right? The impact of climate change will be global. So whatever adaptation measures are suggested, mitigation measures are suggested through IPCC reports, it is usually done at a global level. For example, when IPCC is carrying out these assessments, let's say IPCC wants to suggest a mitigation measure. Let's say it wants to suggest establishment of solar plants in few countries. So it will look at the cost assessment. So obviously to establish a solar plant in a developing country like, let's say, India, would any day it would be cheaper compared to establishing a similar solar plant, let's say, in the US. Because of the status of the economy, right? In advanced economies, the cost of a similar project will be much higher as compared to the cost of a similar project in a developing nation or in an underdeveloped country. So given this mismatch between developed and developing economies, IPCC ends up suggesting low-cost options. So what does this do? This will place a higher burden on developing countries, underdeveloped countries. So this essentially erases the principle of equity. When IPCC is focusing on global solutions, when it is focusing on low-cost options, it always prioritizes the least cost assessment, right? So when it is bringing out least cost options or low-cost options, obviously the burden of carrying out climate action, the burden with regard to reducing emissions, adopting mitigation and adaptation measures, will fall more on developing and underdeveloped countries as compared to developed nations. However, IPCC is confident that principle of equity can be included under the assessment reports as well. But of course, there would be a lot of subjectivity. If you just go by mathematical statistical modeling systems, of course, the low-cost modeling system will be preferred, and this will tend to put a higher burden on developing nations, underdeveloped countries. But we discussed earlier the principle of equity, the principle of CBDR. The developed countries should take up a higher burden. They should contribute more, they should do more as compared to developing and underdeveloped countries. IPCC says that the principle of equity can be incorporated into the statistical modeling systems as well, so that we can ensure that the burden of climate action is placed more on developed nations of the global north, and they can even be pushed to assist and support the countries of the global south in helping in implementing the climate action efforts. So IPCC is quite confident about this, but the recent study carried out by Indian researchers, right, they bring out some alarming consequences in the coming decades. Based on the current path that countries are following, based on the findings of IPCC assessment reports, the researchers from India have predicted that the divide between developed and developing countries is likely to remain in the coming decades. The economic and developmental divide that exists will remain as it is, or it might even increase. But however, the burden on global south countries will also be higher with regard to climate change. So this is unfair. This could dilute the principle of equity even further. For example, the new study has brought out a prediction, an assessment, that in all the scenarios that were studied, more than 500 plus scenarios, future scenarios were examined. In all these scenarios, developed countries were seen to be contributing less with regard to their per capita emissions. Developing underdeveloped regions, let's say for example South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa and West Asia as well, right? Several other parts of Africa and few other parts of Asia, which are considered as less developed, they will contribute more. They will face a higher burden as a result of climate change and climate action compared to developed countries, right? Essentially, the principle of equity is seen getting diluted in the coming decades as per this study. The concern of the researchers is that these underdeveloped areas of Asia, Africa in particular, they account for nearly 60% of the global population. The population burden is high in these regions, in these countries. And since they are underdeveloped, they will have more developmental problems. They will have millions of people living in poverty. They will face many challenges with basic necessities like education, water, food security, healthcare, etc. Which means these governments present here, they should have flexibility to use cheaper options to grow their economies. Like for example, they should continue using fossil fuels, at least for a few more decades, to ensure that they can grow their economy and uplift their people and solve their developmental problems. But this space may not be available to them, as developed countries will continue to remain the top emitters. Even though their intensity of emissions have gone down, they will still remain the top emitters, and on a per capita basis, if you use per capita emissions as a metric, right, which is one of the most fair metric to compare the performance of different countries, developed and industrialized countries will continue to have very high per capita emissions for the next 2 decades. Because their economic model, their consumption patterns are not going to change. So on average, each citizen from developed economies will contribute more emissions compared to a citizen from a developing or underdeveloped country. So this divide will keep on increasing, or it will persist, but the pressure on developing countries is going to increase as they will be expected to do more, to contribute more with regard to climate action efforts. Now let's say, for example, if you push a country like Bangladesh to implement solar, wind energy and other clean forms of energy, right? So this will drag out the investments. It will crowd out investments from, let's say, fossil fuel based industries, right? From there, the investments will be drawn out and it will start crowding into clean renewable sector. Even though it's good as far as climate action is concerned, problem is a poor country, a developing country, like let's say Bangladesh or African countries, they may not be able to afford the cost of the transition, right? So this will weaken their economies. This will subdue their growth. This will further affect their population and it will prevent them from achieving their developmental goals. Whereas developed countries will remain at higher levels of development. They will continue contributing higher per capita emissions. So this is the dilution of equity that the researchers are talking about in their study. They are pointing out that inequities between global north and global south is likely to persist because of the fundamental difference in the consumption patterns of developing and underdeveloped countries. If you compare developing and underdeveloped countries with the developed world, there is a fundamental difference in the consumption pattern. In developing nations, underdeveloped countries, the basic consumption is about the basic necessities, like basic food, water, essential medicines, etc. But in developed nations, where there is a high standard of living, right, consumption patterns are more focused on luxury. It's focused on increasing the standard of living, which further increases the energy consumption, which increases emissions at a per capita level, right? They have smaller populations, right? They live in developed economies, but they contribute more to emissions. So this becomes a huge mismatch between the more populous developing countries and the developed economies. So writers are predicting that until 2050 at least, the divide is likely to persist and even increase, and this is of great concern. And the other important finding is that based on ongoing climate action efforts, mitigation efforts which are being undertaken, the researchers are predicting that developing countries will be pushed by the global community to contribute more to afforestation, to contribute more to carbon capture and carbon sequestration. As I told you, these projects will be cheaper in developing countries. So what developed countries will do, they will provide some funds maybe and some technology, but they will push the developing and underdeveloped countries to do more, right? To focus more on afforestation, to create carbon sinks, to set up carbon capture and storage and sequestration technologies, to remove some of the greenhouse gases. While developed countries may themselves not do this, they'll bring out the technology and give some funds and push the burden onto developing nations, right? So that remains a concern, and based on IPCC assessment, the researchers are pointing out that developing countries will be put under this unfair burden. Poor countries will be pushed to take up a greater burden of mitigation and carbon sequestration, and this again dilutes the principle of equity. So essentially there are two concerns here. One, developed countries will continue to have higher per capita emissions, right? Whereas global community is likely to force developing underdeveloped countries to cut down their emissions. And at the same time, there will be greater burden on developing nations, underdeveloped countries, to focus on carbon sequestration, carbon capture technologies. So this in a way dilutes the principle of equity. It will further increase the divide between global north and the global south. So that is what this study conducted by Indian researchers has found out. Of course, as I told you, it won't be an accurate assessment. It's not that it will be 100% accurate. There could be few shortcomings in this prediction, but that is at least what the researchers are saying based on scientific data brought out by IPCC. So this will disregard the notion of historical responsibility that we thought we had placed on global north. Countries like India have always been proud of their role in climate change negotiations because we championed the principle of equity, we championed the principle of CBDR and ensured that it is placed on global north countries. But in essence, in reality, we are actually seeing a dilution of these principles. So this disregards the very notion of historical responsibilities and it increases the burden on the global south, right? It may not give enough carbon space for developing underdeveloped countries to grow their economies, to achieve their developmental goals. So that is a concern being flagged by this important article. Now, coming to the last point, why does climate equity matter so much? As I explained, climate equity is inbuilt into climate change negotiations. If you look at Article number 3 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, it has incorporated the principle of equity and CBDR. Since 1990s, when the climate change negotiations started, developing and underdeveloped countries have ensured that the developed nations are held accountable for their historical emissions. So these principles have been incorporated into the convention. But if it is not followed in practice, if developed countries don't take up the higher burden, and instead if they push it on to developing underdeveloped nations, then that is an erosion of these principles of equity. It will dilute the climate change convention itself. It will weaken the very spirit of our climate action efforts amongst the global community members. It will place a greater burden on developing underdeveloped countries while allowing the developed countries to continue their path, right, where they will keep on having higher per capita emissions. So these are the various concerns that the writers of the column are expressing based on this study that was conducted in India. So based on this exact topic, I've given you a mains question at the end. I expect you to write an answer and practice answer writing by using all the points that we have discussed. Right, the structure that I have followed will directly help you in writing an answer. If you just follow the same structure and use the points, the key points that we have discussed, you will be able to write a good answer for this question. So before we take up the next article, a very important announcement. As part of the free special classes that we are running on the Unacademy app, today we have 2 classes scheduled for international relations. At 1 p.m., I'll be taking up a special session on the contribution of Lal Bahadur Shastri as then India's Prime Minister to India's foreign policy. We'll understand the contributions of Lal Bahadur Shastri and how the then Prime Minister shaped Indian foreign policy. Then at 5 p.m. today, we have another important session focusing on the contribution of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. What was the role of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi in shaping Indian foreign policy? So both are very important topics, so do attend these sessions live, and the link for these classes is provided in the video description below. Now let's look at the next column from page number 6. This column is examining the current situation in Myanmar and how it has impacted press freedom, particularly in Myanmar and as well as in the region beyond Myanmar. So let's talk about what's happening in Myanmar briefly. We have been covering this topic because this is a developing story which directly impacts India. Given that Myanmar is our eastern neighbor, right? It's a priority country for India. And all these developments happening in Myanmar will have a direct impact on India. So as a result, the topic becomes relevant. So let's look at a brief history of Myanmar's political crisis and talk about the current situation and then look at what the writer is trying to convey. See, Myanmar has remained under long periods of military rule. After it became independent from British colonial rule in 1948, Myanmar was actually a democratic state for a short period. But in 1962, Myanmar's military regime, which has always been power hungry, right, which has always been meddling in Myanmar's politics, it toppled the then civilian government and established a military regime. The military leadership took over the country. Throughout the government, staged a military coup, and the rule of the military junta was established. So since then, until 2010, Myanmar remained a complete military autocracy. In 1980s, there was a brief period where pro-democracy protests were held. There was a large-scale pro-democracy movement in the late 1980s, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of the NLD, National League for Democracy. This was a party founded by her father, who is considered as the founding father of Myanmar. Aung San Suu Kyi, right? Her father, General Aung San, played a critical role in Burma's independence from British rule. So it was under General Aung San that Myanmar had transitioned to a democracy, right? But this government was thrown out by the military regime in 1962 and a military coup had been carried out. Following this, decades of military rule persisted. So there have been no constitutional fundamental rights, no human rights in the country, and Myanmar's military has been known for its brutal oppressive tactics, where it persecutes the minority communities, especially ethnic minorities. It has targeted pro-democracy protesters, civilian movements which have called for more rights. They've all been crushed with brutal force by Myanmar's military. So there is a history of instability and violence and chaos in Myanmar. So in 1980s, elections had been held where Aung San Suu Kyi, the daughter of General Aung San, was supposed to win the elections and form a democratic government. But the military generals panicked. They nullified the elections, cancelled the results, placed Aung San Suu Kyi under house arrest. And when pro-democracy protests started, they crushed the protests with brutal force. So basically from 1962 till 2010, Myanmar never saw any signs of democracy. But as a result of these actions by the military, Myanmar was targeted with economic sanctions by the Western countries. United States, European Union, right? All the Western countries. They put economic sanctions on Myanmar to punish the military regime economically in order to ensure that the constitutional, fundamental and human rights are protected in Myanmar. So this Western pressure, it forced Myanmar to carry out a transition in 2010. As a result of Western pressure under economic sanctions, Myanmar's military paved the way for a partial democracy in 2010. I'm calling it a partial democracy because the changes that were carried out in 2010, it was not full-fledged democratic reforms. Only partial reforms were carried out. A new constitution was introduced where the military apparently stepped away from direct rule and it introduced so-called elections. But these elections were open only for few seats in the parliament. Majority of the parliamentary seats were reserved for military officers, for military officials. Essentially, military officials would be nominated into the parliament and they would hold the majority. So that is no democracy. That is not a true or representative democracy. But however, elections were introduced after a long time and the political parties were allowed to contest. So there were few civilian representatives, but still it was a military regime controlled by the military. So a partial democracy was introduced, which was Myanmar's first major experiment with democracy since 1962. But Western countries did not lift the sanctions. Since this was not a full-fledged reform, right? Western countries did not recognize the transition, they did not lift the sanctions. So again, the economic pressure continued on Myanmar. So finally, in 2015, Myanmar transitioned into a full-fledged democracy. The military stepped aside completely, fresh elections were introduced, and this time, majority of the seats were opened for direct elections. And as expected, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, the National League for Democracy, won the elections and established a government for the next 5 years. So from 2015 to 2020, Myanmar had transitioned into a democratic state where at least elections were being held. But again, this doesn't mean that Myanmar became a true democracy. Myanmar was what we call an electoral democracy. At least elections will be held. There will be an elected government. But still the real authority lied with the military. The generals, they still controlled the key decisions. And a lot of violations continued taking place in Myanmar, even under an elected democratic government. For example, you might have heard about ethnic Rohingya Muslim community in the Rakhine state of Myanmar and how they have been persecuted, targeted by the radical Buddhists in the country with the backing of Myanmar's army. Similarly, many other ethnic indigenous groups like the Shan community, the Kachins, they've all been targeted, persecuted, oppressed by Myanmar's military regime. And this continued even when there was an elected civilian government. But at least this was better because, at least for the sake of it, there was an elected government and elections were taking place and democratic grassroots were strengthening. So after 5 years, the next elections were held in 2020. Right? There was supposed to be a transition of government. And in these elections as well, NLD won popular support. But this triggered anxiety amongst the military leaders. They realized that democratic leaders were becoming popular. Elections were becoming popular. Aung San Suu Kyi's popularity was increasing. So in 2020, the military leaders again interfered with the election process. In February 2021, they nullified the election results without any basis, without any evidence. They alleged that electoral fraud, electoral malpractices had been carried out. And they nullified the election results and arrested all the political leaders. So democracy was again suspended and a state of emergency was imposed in Myanmar, thus turning Myanmar back into a military regime. So the military junta was back in power. The Tatmadaw, which is Myanmar's military, Myanmar's armed forces are called the Tatmadaw. So they captured power again in the country by declaring a state of emergency in February 2021. So now it's been 3 years since the emergency was reimposed. And since then, Myanmar has deteriorated further. Immediately after the emergency was imposed, pro-democracy protests broke out. Civilians and the political parties, they all united together to lead major pro-democracy protests across cities, towns and villages to fight for their right, to fight for the restoration of democracy in the country. But these protests were crushed by the military with brutal force. Large-scale human rights violations were carried out. In fact, over the last 3 years, Myanmar's military has used brutal force, disproportionate force, to target unarmed protesters. It has carried out airstrikes. It has carried out large-scale ground military operations, and even artillery guns have been used against civilian population to target these protesters. But however, all the civilian and political forces have united with some of the armed ethnic insurgent groups which are fighting in Myanmar. Myanmar has been going through insurgency by various tribal indigenous communities from a long time. They are opposed to the military. They are opposed to Myanmar's government. So they've all united with the pro-democracy civilian protesters and the political parties. And now they have stepped up their rebellion against the military. And especially since the last 8 to 10 months, the organized rebellion by the armed groups, by the ethnic insurgent groups, accompanied with the ongoing civilian protests for democracy, has brought a lot of pressure on the military, and it has even suffered a major setback in the last few months. In fact, in October 2023, on 27th October 2023, some of the armed insurgent groups, they formed an alliance called the Three Brotherhood Alliance. 3 major armed insurgent outfits like the Arakan Army and few other insurgent groups belonging to the Chin community and the Shan community. They all united to form the Three Brotherhood Alliance, and they launched Operation 1027. 27 is the date. 10 refers to the 10th month, that is October. So on 27th October 2023, Operation 1027 was launched by the Three Brotherhood Alliance, which is a coalition of 3 different armed ethnic insurgent groups. And following this, these insurgent groups have delivered a significant defeat to Myanmar's military. For the first time, Myanmar's military is losing control at several critical locations along the Indian border and also along the Chinese border. Important towns and cities have been taken over by the armed groups and by the pro-democracy protest organizations. And Myanmar's military has lost control over a significant part of its territory. Reports are indicating that almost 40% of Myanmar's territory is not under the control of the military, meaning the government has been weakened. Its territorial control is being taken away by the rebellion groups or the armed groups and the protest organizations which are fighting against Myanmar's military. Especially near the Indian border, important border gates, border villages have been liberated from the military, and the ethnic armed groups have completely taken over. So this, of course, represents a big concern for India as well, because it has triggered a humanitarian situation. There has been a refugee crisis. When the military was targeting the ethnic groups, there has been a huge refugee flow into India. For example, the Chin community, which is related to the Mizos in Mizoram, they have entered India in large numbers by crossing the border to seek refuge in Mizoram. The Zomi community, which is related to the Kukis of Manipur, even they have sought refuge in India. And there are reports that the current ethnic violence and crisis that we have seen in Manipur is related to the entry of the Zomi refugees from Myanmar. The Manipur state government has indicated that the current ethnic crisis that we have seen in Manipur, the violence that we have witnessed, is partly due to the entry of Zomi refugees from Myanmar. This is, however, dismissed by the Kuki community, right? The blame is placed on the Meitei majority in Manipur for having triggered the ethnic violence. But irrespective of that, whatever is happening in Myanmar has had a direct impact on India, right? There has been a significant refugee flow into India. There have been concerns related to border security, right? India has concerns about increased movement of insurgents, cross-border movement of insurgents. We also fear an uptick in organized crime, especially drug trafficking, arms trafficking, which could enable Northeast insurgent groups. So there are major security threats perceived by India. But along with that, there has been large-scale violation of human rights in Myanmar, right? In almost every state, in the Chin state, in the Shan state, in Kachin province, in Rakhine state, in all the major states, there has been large-scale human rights violations, and more importantly, press freedom has been completely crushed. Freedom of press, freedom of the media has been completely crushed by the military. So these are the concerns being flagged by the writer, and the writer is calling upon the ASEAN group and other important countries in the region to pressurize Myanmar to pull Myanmar away from this path. In fact, the ASEAN group, which represents the 10 Southeast Asian countries, it had brought out a 5-point consensus in 2021 when the crisis started after the emergency was reimposed. Because Myanmar is a ASEAN member. It's one of the Southeast Asian countries. It's a member of the ASEAN group. So other ASEAN countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, and others, they negotiated with Myanmar's military leaders and they tried to implement a 5-point consensus, which included an immediate ceasefire and a gradual return to democracy. This plan was brought out by the ASEAN countries, but however, its failure in implementation is a concern. Myanmar's military has ignored the 5-point consensus. ASEAN countries themselves are divided because within ASEAN group, there are few countries like Cambodia, for example, right? And even Thailand. They don't put much pressure on Myanmar because they have very good relations with Myanmar and they also have very good ties with China. So there is a role of China as well in perpetuating and continuing the crisis. So of course, India is concerned, worried about all the developments. And given that we have an Act East policy where we pay special attention to Southeast Asian countries, right? India is also closely involved in monitoring the situation, and we have been trying to use our influence to stabilize the situation in Myanmar. So the writer of the column says that ASEAN countries have the perfect opportunity because they have leverage on Myanmar, they have influence on Myanmar. So they need to pressurize Myanmar's military leaders to stop the atrocities, the violence, push them to step down and reintroduce democracy and constitutional rights in the country. So countries like India can also play a positive role. But however, India is very cautious. We never interfere unnecessarily in Myanmar, right? Given the Chinese influence in Myanmar and given China's connections with Northeast insurgent outfits and how China has directly supported Northeast insurgents against India, India is very mindful of the security situation. So we want Myanmar to be in India's favor at any cost. We have followed a very realistic policy towards Myanmar. If required, India has even ignored human rights and the democratic issues. We have remained silent on these issues sometimes, and we have never criticized Myanmar's military junta. Because India also wants to maintain good relations with Myanmar's military junta, just like China has. In fact, after China, India happens to be the most influential country in Myanmar. We have given a lot of investments, funds, and even weapons to Myanmar's military. So India retains that close relationship to ensure that our security interests are taken care of along the India-Myanmar border. So India has never criticized Myanmar's military for all the atrocities. But irrespective of that, India still has diplomatic and economic influence which we can use and work with ASEAN countries to bring that pressure on the military leadership to stabilize the situation in the country. So that is what we take away from this important column. Next, on page number 6, there is an editorial regarding the upcoming elections in India. In fact, we have a related column as well on the same page. So I'm going to club both the articles and take a quick look at what these articles are trying to highlight. If you look at this editorial, it's mainly focused on the upcoming general elections, the 18th Lok Sabha elections. Recently, Election Commission of India has announced the election schedule. I'm sure many of you would know that elections are slated to be held from April to May, and on 4th of June, the counting will take place and the results will be announced. So given that elections have been announced in India, the editorial is highlighting a few concerns. It's calling upon the Election Commission of India, which is a constitutional body mandated to hold elections in the country. The editorial is calling upon this constitutional body to ensure that free and fair elections are held in the country. This is the foundational principle of a constitutional democracy, right? A constitutional democracy is built on the fact that different political parties are given a level playing field to compete in direct elections. But what if few parties have certain advantages? What if few parties have a privileged position, right? Will that upset the free and fair equation? Will that upset the level playing field? And will that lead to manipulation of election, right? Democratic elections might be held, but what if certain parties, right? What if they are able to leverage their resources, leverage their grassroots network, their influence, and what if they are able to manipulate at least the voters' opinions? So elections might happen, the public, the voters might express their choice, but eventually the question is whether these elections can be truly free and fair. Because genuine questions have indeed come up. For example, Election Commission has always been criticized for not properly enforcing the Model Code of Conduct. In fact, the problem is Model Code of Conduct can never be strictly enforced as it has no legal backing, it has no statutory backing. It's just a set of guidelines that the Election Commission of India has notified, which comes into play when elections are announced, right? But in implementing these guidelines, in penalizing the violators, often Election Commission has been accused of partiality and bias towards certain leaders and certain parties. For example, there have been several political leaders who have been delivering hate speech, who have been seeking votes in previous elections in the names of soldiers, in the name of religion, in the name of caste. These campaign techniques are prohibited. They are not allowed under the Model Code of Conduct. But few leaders, few parties have gotten away with these violations, whereas few other parties have been targeted by the Election Commission. Take the question of political funding, which has hit national and global headlines. The opaque electoral bond system, which was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. It has shed light on the extent of corporate funding into Indian political parties and how few parties at the national level and even at the state level, they have cornered majority of the funds, right? There are few regional level parties, state level parties that have cornered a large part of the electoral funds which are given as corporate donations. Few national parties as well, they have cornered majority of the share of the funds. So this itself creates an unfair, unequal playing field for various other political parties, particularly the opposition. There has also been a tendency where the media, even the bureaucracy to an extent, has been accused of displaying a bias in favor of the ruling party. This is not just at the center, even at the state level, right? Even at the state level, there have been accusations that the administrative machinery, the bureaucratic machinery, which at the end of the day is responsible for conducting elections under the Election Commission, has been accused of unfairness and displaying being partial and displaying a bias in favor of the ruling party while targeting the opposition. So this, in a way, creates an unfair or unequal playing field that could disrupt the very spirit of free and fair elections. Plus, there has already been a big controversy with the composition of Election Commission of India itself. Right? One election commissioner had retired, and recently another election commissioner, just days before the elections were announced, one of the other election commissioner has resigned. His resignation caused a lot of speculation, right? And now the government has appointed 2 new election commissioners to fill the vacancies. So with regard to the appointment process, there has been a controversy recently. Previously, the government had complete powers with regard to appointing the election commissioners and the chief election commissioner. But last year, the Supreme Court intervened and established a selection committee where the judiciary gave itself a role in the appointment process. So this Supreme Court appointed selection panel would be headed by the Prime Minister along with the leader of opposition and the Chief Justice of India. So essentially, by giving a role for the opposition and the Chief Justice, a sense of fairness was brought into the system with regard to appointing election commissioners and chief election commissioner. But the government has overruled the judgment by bringing out an amendment. The government has overturned the landmark verdict of the Supreme Court by amending the act, and now it has introduced a new process of appointing the election commissioners. So the panel, the selection panel, now gives complete majority to the government. So this panel is headed by the Prime Minister and a cabinet minister appointed by the Prime Minister and leader of opposition. So even though leader of opposition is included, the majority is still in favor of the government. The PM and the cabinet minister would obviously be on the same side, giving the government full control over the appointment process. So this raises few questions as well about the overall functioning of the Election Commission, right? The question whether Indian media can be fair to all the parties. The question whether political funds will benefit certain parties, certain leaders. And the question whether Election Commission, can it conduct the elections in a fair manner, in a free manner, to ensure that the integrity of the elections is protected. So these are the concerns being flagged by the editorial, and it's urging upon the Election Commission to ensure that it fulfills its constitutional duty. There is a related article on the same page, which is written by M.K. Narayanan. M.K. Narayanan was the former governor of West Bengal, but before becoming a governor, he was a top IPS officer, and he retired as the National Security Advisor of India. He was the former NSA. Before that, he was the former Director of Intelligence Bureau. So he is someone with a lot of experience in the field of security, intelligence, and even politics and administration. So based on his experience, he is talking about one upcoming concern for elections, not just in India, but around the world. He is referring to the disruptive power of AI, the disruptive power of artificial intelligence, and how it could threaten elections around the world. That is the focus of this column. See, this year is called the election year around the world. More than 50 countries are headed towards elections. We already had elections in Bhutan, in Pakistan recently, right? Russia is currently going through elections. India is all set to hold its elections. So many countries, even the US, will be headed towards elections at the end of the year. So more than 50 countries are headed towards elections. And this comes at a time when artificial intelligence has already made a disruptive entry into our lives, especially generative AI. Generative AI, even though it brings numerous advantages and opportunities, it does have the potential for misuse. And if such a powerful technological tool is misused, particularly to manipulate elections, to manipulate the voters, to carry out propaganda, to spread misinformation, right? It represents a grave threat to democratic institutions. It represents a very serious threat to democracy and democratic elections around the world. So that is the concern that the writer is highlighting. In fact, we have been discussing this theme in various sessions as well. We have spoken about deep fakes that are produced by using generative AI tools. Today, AI algorithms are so sophisticated that they can produce hyper-realistic media, right? They can create entirely new text as if it's written by a human being. They can create images, even videos and audio files, which looks or sounds very, very authentic, very real. But they would have been generated by AI algorithms. These hyper-realistic media forms, right, which are synthetically generated through AI algorithms or generative AI tools, is what we refer to as deep fake technology. Deep fakes can be easily used to spread fake news, to carry out misinformation, to spread wrong information, right? At least information which is partially incorrect. And this could be used by political organizations or even by extremist outfits and radical organizations to spread propaganda and use the propaganda to swing electoral choices. Now imagine, what if there is a scandalous video which is leaked right before elections, which shows a certain political leader in a compromising position, right? That could hurt the image of the politician. And let's say this was entirely a part of a propaganda campaign, right? Let's say a politician has been caught on a video accepting bribe. But in reality, the politician would have never done that. But through deepfakes, such a video can be generated, which looks very real, very authentic. Even the voice can be cloned. The voice can sound exactly like that of the other person, right? And if these deepfakes are circulated, especially on social media, on the internet, if it goes viral, it will reach the masses in no time. It will influence the minds of the voters, right? So this could disrupt free and fair elections. So this could happen anywhere in the world. And that is the concern the writer is expressing, right? So based on his security experience, he's talking about the disruptive power of generative AI tools like Google's Gemini, OpenAI's ChatGPT, then Sora, which is a video generative AI platform that OpenAI is coming out with. And there are many other AI algorithms already available at a very cheap, reasonable cost, through which deepfakes can be very easily produced, right? So they're almost indistinguishable from original content. So such fake content which has been created synthetically, if it is put for the wrong use, it could have devastating consequences for elections and democracy, not just in India, but around the world. So the writer is calling upon governments to exercise caution and to regulate AI tools and ensure that deep fakes are not used to disrupt the election process. So this requires more awareness amongst the people as well. Voters should be more mindful about deep fakes and how they can be misused for propaganda and to spread fake news. All of us can become more self-aware so that with careful observation, you can actually identify these deep fake videos. At the first glance, we may not get to know what's the difference between a deep fake and an original video or an image. But on careful observation, if you're better aware, if you can spot the differences, you can figure out which of the video is fake. So this helps in putting a stop to the spread of such fake news and misinformation campaigns, right? So this is what the writer is expressing. And it's important to be mindful of the consequences of misuse of generative AI, especially its impact on democratic elections. So this completes my detailed discussion of all the important editorials and columns in today's newspaper. Now let's head towards the prelim section and take a quick look at the smaller articles in the newspaper. We have an article on page number 1. Please make a correction here. It's a typo. On page number 1, we have an article which is important for environment and ecology and also for art and culture, not economy. Just make a correction here. On the first page itself, we have this article, important for environment, ecology and art and culture. There are actually two topics that we can draw from this article. One is related to a tiger reserve in Arunachal Pradesh, the Namdapha National Park and Tiger Reserve, which finds a mention in the article. And the article is also mentioning two indigenous communities found in this part of Northeast India. So let's talk about both the topics. First, we'll discuss about the Namdapha National Park and Tiger Reserve. The most unique point about this protected area is that Namdapha Tiger Reserve is India's easternmost tiger reserve. It's located over here. Can you see this location that I'm marking in Arunachal Pradesh? This is where Namdapha National Park and Tiger Reserve is located along the India-Myanmar border. There can be a map-based question in prelims with regard to the location of Namdapha National Park and Tiger Reserve. So please note down the location. It's in Arunachal Pradesh, it's part of the eastern Himalayas, and it's located along the India-Myanmar boundary. Is that clear? So this is a key habitat for important species. It's part of the eastern Himalayas, as I mentioned, and I hope you know that eastern Himalayas is one of the biodiversity hotspots of the world, which means the region is a hub of biodiversity, but it is facing a lot of stress. It's under tremendous pressure, right? So it is located in the Patkai Bum range. It is wedged between Dafa Bum ridge of the Mishmi Hills in Arunachal, which extends towards Nagaland, and Patkai ranges on the other side. In fact, this National Park and Tiger Reserve is named after the Namdapha River, which flows in a north to south direction. So the vegetation you find here, the type of vegetation, it's a mixed vegetation. You find evergreen forests, moist deciduous forests, subtropical, temperate, and even alpine forests. So given the unique topography of this region and the climatic conditions present here, you find a variety of different vegetation in this protected area. The most important species found here has to be the Namdapha flying squirrel that you see here in the image, which is critically endangered. The last live individual was spotted almost 30-40 years ago. There has been no visual sighting in the recent years. Some believe it might have gone extinct as well. But as of now on the IUCN red list, it is critically endangered, the Namdapha flying squirrel. And this is also home to the red panda that you can see here in the image. Red panda is found in parts of China and parts of India as well in the Himalayan ecosystem. The red panda is an endangered species on the IUCN red list. So these are the two important threatened species found in Namdapha National Park and Tiger Reserve. Of course, it's home to the tigers as well. It is a tiger reserve. Apart from that, there is an endangered red panda and critically endangered Namdapha flying squirrel. Now, apart from this, the article is mentioning two important indigenous communities. It's referring to the Lisu community, also called the Lohani community, and also it refers to the Singpho community, or also called the Jigpo community. These communities are native to this region. They are found in Arunachal Pradesh, parts of Assam, in Myanmar, and also in parts of China. In fact, the Lisu community, right, they are believed to have come from the Yunnan region of China, from the Yunnan province of China. Until recently, they didn't even have Indian citizenship. They were seen as illegal settlers from China and Myanmar. But later, the Lisus who have settled in Arunachal Pradesh on the Indian side, they were given citizenship. They have their own unique customs, unique language that they speak. They have a rich cultural heritage. And similarly, even the Singpho community, which is found in Tinsukia district of Assam as well, right? They have a very unique cultural tradition associated with them. And they have their links with Myanmar and China. The community is spread over this whole region. Now, this article is referring to the unique naming practice with regard to children who are born in their families. In fact, what is interesting is that the Lisu and Singpho communities, they give their children alphanumeric names. So it's not just Elon Musk who gives very weird and unique alphanumeric names to his children, but there is actually a cultural tradition within the Lisu and Singpho community where they use numbers to name their child. And the numbers used are in order of their birth. The eldest child will have let's say number 1 or number 2, like that, in the order of their birth, in the order the children were delivered, right? The numbers are used to assign names to the children as well. So this is done for both boys and girls, and to create a distinction, they prefix another name to the number. So it becomes an alphanumeric name. So that is something which is unique to the Lisu and Singpho community found here in Arunachal Pradesh. Next, we have another question related to art and culture. This is from Bihar. The article is referring to Bhagalpur, right? Bhagalpur is located in western Bihar. You can see that here in the map. This is the Bhagalpur district in western Bihar, right? Now, Bhagalpur is known for 2 important products that it produces. One is the Bhagalpur silk. It's a major hub of silk handloom industry. So the article here is talking about the challenges being faced by the silk industry in Bhagalpur. According to the article, the rising cost of production, the rising cost of inputs, and the dropping demand and the difficulty in obtaining labor has affected the silk handlooms present in Bhagalpur, and the silk industry is seeing a slow death in Bhagalpur. Now this is quite concerning because Bhagalpur is called Bihar's silk city. It was known for its high quality silk production. Apart from that, Bhagalpur is also known for a unique art form called Manjusha art. Manjusha art form includes a variety of different arts. It includes painting as well, that you can see here, where on a piece of cloth, sometimes on the silk cloth produced here, red, blue, green dyes are used to bring out these unique Manjusha paintings. They often depict snakes, and they depict Hindu mythological stories of Hindu gods and goddesses. So in Western countries, it's popularly known as snake painting. They popularly call it snake painting or snake art because there is a frequent usage of snakes in the art form. So this is closely connected to the religious and cultural heritage of the region. And so Manjusha art is something that is specific to the Bhagalpur region in Bihar. So please remember that. Next, we have this article on page number 12 that refers to a major maritime security operation that was carried out by Indian forces in the Arabian Sea. As you know, towards the Persian Gulf, Gulf of Aden and Horn of Africa, there are multiple security threats as far as commercial shipping is concerned. First of all, we have Somalian piracy towards Horn of Africa and Gulf of Aden. Somalian piracy has been a concern from many, many years near Horn of Africa and in the Gulf of Aden region. Somalian pirates have often expanded their range of operations, even targeting ships near Persian Gulf, near Lakshadweep Islands of India. So across this part of Indian Ocean, Somalian piracy is a major threat for commercial shipping. So Indian Navy has been countering Somalian piracy from a very long time. Now we have a new threat which has emerged in the same region towards Red Sea, which is the threat posed by the Houthis. The Houthi rebels of Yemen have started targeting commercial ships in the Red Sea and also in the Arabian Sea as well. And they say that this is their support for people of Gaza as far as the Gaza war is concerned. So multiple security threats have emerged which disrupts shipping and navigation across Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean. So Indian Navy is frequently deployed here along with Indian Air Force to ensure that the shipping channels are protected. In 2019, Indian Navy had launched a major anti-piracy mission called Operation Sankalp. We collaborate with other friendly navies from West Asia and with other global powers, including Japan, US, European navies, Australia, sometimes with China as well. So by working with all these foreign navies, we have carried out anti-piracy operations from many years. In 2019, after increase in piracy threat, Indian Navy had launched Operation Sankalp, which is an ongoing naval operation. In the last 5 years, Indian Navy, along with support from Coast Guard and Indian Air Force, has diffused many piracy situations where pirates have hijacked commercial ships or they're in the process of hijacking, but it has been disrupted by Indian Navy. So one such operation was recently conducted under Operation Sankalp, and this stands out because it's one of the largest and the longest operations that Indian Navy has carried out, that too so far away from India's coastline. Very close to the Gulf of Aden and the Persian Gulf, there was a foreign vessel which had been hijacked by multiple Somalian pirates. Several people were held hostage, the crew members had been held hostage, and Indian Navy along with Indian Air Force carried out this joint operation. Several advanced assets were used, multiple naval ships of Indian Navy were deployed, and drones were also used in this operation. But what is unfortunate is that the pirates, they shot down one of the drones of the Indian Navy, according to media reports. And the pirates were threatening to kill the hostages as well, turning this into a very tricky situation for the Indian Navy. So possibly for the first time in a real operation, the Indian Navy has paradropped the Marcos, the Marine Commandos. The Indian Air Force has used its C-17 Globemaster, which is a heavy lift transport aircraft that we have procured from US. And through the C-17 aircraft, rubberized boats, inflatable rubberized boats were paradropped into the Indian Ocean. And the Marine Commandos, or the Marcos, which is a special force unit of the Indian Navy, right? It specializes in para-jumps as well. So they have been paradropped along with these rubberized boats, and they have reached the hijacked vessel, boarded the vessel, and defused the situation. Other advanced assets were also used apart from the Marine Commandos. Apart from the Marcos, long endurance drones like the MQ-9B Reaper drone was also used in the operation for surveillance, which is also procured from the US. Right? Even the P-8I Poseidon reconnaissance aircraft, which is with the Indian Navy, was also used for surveillance and reconnaissance in this operation. So why am I stressing upon these points? I'm stressing upon these points because it shows the extent of India-US defense collaboration and how American military assets have played a significant role in enhancing the operational reach of the Indian Armed Forces. Without the C-17 Globemaster, Indian Air Force would not have been able to easily deploy the Marcos and the rubberized boats at the site of the operation. Right? The Reaper drone and the P-8I Poseidon aircraft, which is also of US origin, right, has always helped the Indian Navy in maritime surveillance and maritime reconnaissance. The P-8I is also known for its anti-submarine warfare capabilities. So in this long-lasting operation that lasted almost 40 hours, the Indian Navy, with the help of Indian Air Force, has successfully defused the situation. It forced the pirates to surrender, all the hostages were safely secured, and it marks a successful operation for the Indian Navy. So it is important to know about Operation Sankalp, the role of India in countering piracy in the region, and also how India-US defense relations has helped in modernizing the Indian Armed Forces. So that is what we take away from the last article. And on this note, I would like to conclude the discussion for today. So please take up these two questions for your answer writing practice. It's all based on what we have studied in the earlier articles. So I hope you write your answers and post them in the comment section. And if you have liked the session today, please let me know in the comments. Do press the like button and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. That is it for today. We'll see you again tomorrow. Thanks for watching.